The Naked Mormonism podcast, specifically for the people who haven't heard it, tell them what it is. But then I also want to know when it started, and when it did start, what was the original intention of the podcast? And is that still what you're playing through? Like, my channel has morphed completely, and now it's just a tool of my own ego. No, but it's changed a lot. So, So what has it become versus what was its intention, unless it stayed the same?
Well, obviously it has morphed and adapted as I have played off of the audience and received feedback and understood what I want the general mission and goal of the podcast to be. The way that it started was when I began studying, not necessarily studying to any extent, but listening to a lot of podcasts. And I was beginning to research Mormon history to try and understand and comprehend the belief system that I had my entire life,
right,
at a deeper level that I had never examined in my entire growing up years.
Yeah.
I started listening to Mormon podcasts, Thank God I'm Atheist and Mormon Stories, and listening to these podcasts and hearing these people talking about Mormonism. And then as my studies continued progressing through Mormon history, and I would hear these podcasters talk about something happening in Mormon history, and I would hear something that was wrong or something that I wasn't sure about, I would, take issue with it. I would like to, I'd send in an email, or I would think about it, or not even send an email, just scream at the windshield as I was driving the truck. Yeah. Right. So eventually I said, I'm going to find the podcast that, tells the serialized history of Mormonism. And that podcast did not exist. So I decided that would be the perfect podcast for a person in my shoes. So I just decided to make it instead. And that's what it sought to do initially. And, I decided to start with episode 1 with the birth of Joseph Smith. As my studies progressed, I realized that if you're going to tell the story of Joseph Smith and Mormonism, you have to start a long time before that. You have to understand and comprehend a lot of the cultural milieu in which Joseph Smith, grew up,
right,
and understand, American politics throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There's a lot more context to understand. And if I were to start it all again, I would, start it like the American Revolution or something. But even that, it's like, anytime you're studying or talking or reporting about history, you have to decide somewhere to drop a pin. And I decided dropping it at the birth of Joseph Smith was practical. So that's how it started. And it has continued to progress chronologically from there. And as I've studied deeper, it has expanded and slowed. So when I began, I would cover anywhere from, a few months to a year, maybe even 2 years in a single podcast episode of the chronology of Joseph Smith's history. But as I understood more the historical method and started to dive deeper into the initials, the firsthand accounts and the source material that all of the historiographies are reporting on, that's when I realized that I'm going too fast and I'm being far too cavalier, and the chronological progression has slowed significantly in order to create a more holistic sphere of Mormon history. And that has its gives and takes. It's a tough balance to strike, but needless to say, I've kept that same mission statement intact the whole time. However, I've also, begun listening to and studying up on politics and world events more, and trying to become more woke every day. Yeah. and I started incorporating news segments into Naked Mormonism, and trying to deal with current events topics that are going on in the church. And that just diversified the podcast too much and took away from the history, which is what I initially set out to do. So that's when I broke off and started up the Glassbox podcast instead, where I can still keep the Naked Mormonism as the sanctuary of a serialized Mormon history, and still have another platform to talk about, current events issues that are important and that I feel like need to be, covered.